I am Emily Graves. I've never been anyone's favorite, not at home, not at work. My silence has always been mistaken for weakness. And maybe for a while, I let it be. The room smelled like old coffee and broken dreams. No windows, just fluorescent lights that buzzed like dying insects above my head. I sat across from three people I'd worked beside for 7 years, and they looked at me like I was a stranger applying for a job I'd never get. Emily, we need to talk about your future here, said Margaret, the VP who'd never spoken to me directly until today. Her smile was the kind you practice in mirrors too wide, too forced. We're implementing some structural changes. To continue listening to this beautiful and special story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Write your name and the city you're watching from, so I can include a special greeting for you in an upcoming story. The manila folder in front of her was thin. Too thin for 7 years of work. Too thin for the projects I'd built from nothing. For the late nights when I stayed while everyone else went home to their families. We're relocating you to a position that better matches your technical profile, she continued, never once looking me in the eye. You understand, don't you? It's just restructuring. Just restructuring. The words sat in my throat like stones. I nodded once, signed the papers they slid across the table and walked out. Behind me I heard the muffled sound of relief, like they'd been holding their breath, waiting for me to scream or cry or throw something. I didn't. I went home, packed a single suitcase and called my commanding officer. When you're in the reserves, you learn that sometimes retreat is the smartest strategy. Sometimes you have to disappear to see clearly. The base was exactly what I needed. Structured, honest, brutal in its clarity. No politics. No smiles that meant nothing. No meetings about meeting. Just orders, execution, results. For 8 weeks I wore the same uniform every day, ate the same meals, slept in the same narrow bed. Every morning at 500, I ran the same route through the Virginia mountain. Every evening, I sat in the same spot by the communications tent, writing emails on my personal laptop. Not angry emails, not resignation letters, business emails. I'd been thinking about that thin manila folder, about the three faces that couldn't look at me while they destroyed my career. But mostly, I'd been thinking about something else, something I'd buried so deep in my mind that I'd almost forgotten it existed. The conversation with my grandfather, 2 years before he died. We were sitting in his study, surrounded by boxes of documents from his old company. He was trying to organize his affairs, he said, making sure everything was in order. Emily, he'd said, his voice already thin with age, I want you to have something. He'd handed me a manila envelope, much thicker than the one Margaret had used to fire me. Inside were stock certificates, old ones from the company where I now worked, where I'd just been relocated. Your grandmother and I founded this company with 2 other couples back in 1967. We sold our shares when we retired, but we kept a small percentage, a very small percent. I never bothered to sell it because it wasn't worth much then. He'd smiled at me, the same sad smile he'd worn since my grandmother's funeral. It's probably still not worth much, but it's yours now. I'd taken the envelope and forgotten about it, filed it away with birth certificates and old tax returns. But now, sitting in the Virginia mountains with nothing but time and silence, I'd started to remember. The law library at the base was quiet in the evenings. Most soldiers spent their downtime in the recreation room, or calling home. I spent mine researching corporate law, reading annual reports, and making phone calls to very expensive lawyers. The stock certificates were worth more than my grandfather had imagined, much more. The company had gone public in 1987, split twice, merged with a competitor in 1999, and split again in 2015. What had been a 2% stake in a small consulting firm was now a 12% stake in a Fortune 500 company. 12%, not enough to control the company, but enough to ask very uncomfortable questions at board meetings, enough to demand transparency in executive decisions, enough to call for votes of no confidence, enough to matter. I spent 3 weeks on the phone with lawyers, accountants and financial advisors. I learned words like fiduciary duty and shareholder derivative action. I learned that when you own 12% of a company, you have certain rights, rights that sleeping shareholders never exercise, rights that I was about to exercise. The annual shareholder meeting was scheduled for the third Thursday in October. I'd been gone for 6 weeks by then, and according to my sources still inside the company, everyone had assumed I'd quit. They'd already hired my replacement, a young man fresh from business school who worked for half my salary. Margaret had been promoted to senior vice president. She'd moved into the corner office, the one with windows facing the river. She'd given interviews to the trade magazines about fresh perspectives and strategic realignment. She had no idea what was coming. I didn't tell anyone I was coming back, not my few friends at the company, not my neighbors, not even my own sister. I drove home from the base on a Tuesday, 3 days before the shareholder meeting, and spent 48 hours in absolute silence. I didn't turn on the television, I didn't check social media, I didn't answer the phone when it rang. I sat in my living room, surrounded by legal documents and financial statements, and I prepared. The speech was simple. 5 minutes, maybe 6. I'd practiced it in the mirror until every word felt natural, until every pause had meaning. I'd practiced it while running the mountain trails, while folding laundry, while eating dinner alone at my kitchen table. I'd practiced it until it wasn't a speech anymore. It was just the truth, spoken calmly and without anger. On Wednesday night, I laid out my clothes for the next day. Not a uniform. I'd left that at the base. Not a business suit. I'd thrown those away the day I was fired. Instead, I chose a simple black dress. The kind you wear to funerals or graduations. The kind you wear when something is ending and something else is beginning. I went to bed early and slept better than I had in months. When you know exactly what you're going to do and exactly why you're doing it, sleep comes easily. The grand ballroom at the Marriott downtown was exactly as I remembered it from previous years. Too bright, too loud, too full of people who smiled without meaning it. I arrived early before the coffee service, before the registration tables were fully set up. I signed in with the receptionist, a young woman who looked at my name tag twice before recognizing me. Emily Graves. We thought we didn't expect. I'm a shareholder, I said quietly. I have every right to be here. She handed me a voting packet and a name tag. I pinned the tag to my dress and found a seat in the back row, next to the emergency exit. Old habits from military training. Always know where the exits are. Always have a way out. The room filled slowly. I recognized most of the faces. Colleagues who'd ignored me for years. Managers who'd forgotten my name. Executives who'd never acknowledged my existence. They looked comfortable, confident, like people who never questioned whether they belonged. Margaret walked in just before the meeting started, wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. She was laughing at something her assistant had said, her voice carrying across the room like she owned it. Maybe she thought she did. The CEO, the man who'd hired me 7 years ago, who'd shaken my hand at the Christmas party every year and called me Emily from engineering, took the podium at exactly 9. His opening remarks were the same corporate poetry I'd heard at every meeting. Record profits, strategic growth, valued shareholders. Then came the routine business, approval of the annual report, ratification of the accounting firm, re-election of board members. Each motion passed with the kind of board unanimity that comes from owning a room full of people who've never asked a difficult question. If there's no other business, the CEO said, glancing at his watch, I'd like to thank you all for. My voice cut through the room like a blade. I have a question. Every head in the room turned toward me. I stood slowly, my hands steady at my sides, my voice calm and clear. Emily Graves, shareholder. I'd like to know about the recent restructuring in the engineering department. The CEO's smile faltered for just a moment. I'm sorry, Miss Graves, but personnel matters aren't typically discussed at shareholder meetings. If you have specific concerns, I'd encourage you to contact Human Resources. I'm not asking about personnel matters, I said, taking a step forward. I'm asking about fiscal responsibility. When a company eliminates a position that generated $3.2 million in annual revenue and replaces it with a position that cost 50% less, but produces 80% less value, that's a fiduciary issue. The room had gone completely silent. Even the catering staff had stopped moving. Margaret's face had gone pale, and she was whispering urgently to the man next to her. I'm also curious, I continued, about the decision-making process. Were shareholders consulted about this restructure? Was the board informed about the potential revenue impact? The CEO looked toward the company's legal counsel, who stood up slowly. Miss Graves, while we appreciate your concern, Operational decisions are the responsibility of management, not shareholders. The board has full confidence. The board, I interrupted, has a fiduciary duty to shareholders. When management makes decisions that prioritize short-term cost savings over long-term value creation, that's exactly the kind of decision shareholders should be concerned about. I reached into my purse and pulled out a thick folder. I've prepared a formal proposal for the board's consideration, a comprehensive review of recent personnel decisions, including an analysis of their impact on shareholder value. The legal counsel's eyes widened as he realized what I was holding. Miss Graves, you can't just, actually, I can. I smiled for the first time in months. Section 14A8 of the Securities Exchange Act gives any shareholder who's owned at least $2,000 in stock for at least 1 year the right to submit proposals for shareholder consideration. I've owned significantly more than that for significantly longer. The room erupted in whispers. I heard fragments of conversation. Who is she? How much stock does she own? Is this legal? The CEO held up his hand for silence. Miss Graves, perhaps we could discuss this privately after the meeting. I don't think so, I said, my voice carrying easily to the back of the room. Transparency is important, don't you think? Shareholders deserve to know how their company is being managed. I walked to the front of the room, my heels clicking on the polished floor. Every step felt deliberate, purposeful. When I reached the podium, I turned to face the audience. My name is Emily Graves. 2 months ago, I was terminated from my position as senior systems engineer. I was told it was part of a restructuring. I was told my position was being eliminated to right-size the department. Margaret had gone from pale to green. She was staring at me like I was a ghost. What I wasn't told, I continued, was that my position would be immediately filled by someone with half my experience for half my salary. What I wasn't told was that the project I'd been developing, a system that would have generated $3.2 million in annual recurring revenue, was being shelved to cut costs. I opened my folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. This is a stock certificate. It belonged to my grandfather, who co-founded this company in He gave it to me before he died, along with about 200 other certificates that he'd accumulated over the years. The CEO's face had gone white. He was probably doing the math in his head, trying to calculate how much stock I might own. Together, I said, these certificates represent approximately 12% of the company's outstanding shares, which makes me not just a former employee, but also your second largest shareholder. The room exploded in voices. People were standing, talking, pointing. Margaret had put her head in her hands. The CEO was frantically conferring with his legal team. But I wasn't finished. I'm calling for a vote of no confidence in current management, I announced, my voice cutting through the chaos. Specifically, I'm calling for the immediate removal of Margaret Chen from her position as Senior Vice President. Margaret's head snapped up. You can't do that, she said, her voice shaking. You're just angry because you lied to me, I asked calmly. Because you eliminated my position while keeping my project. Because you violated your fiduciary duty to shareholders by prioritizing personal politics over company performance. I turned back to the room. I'm not angry, Margaret. I'm disappointed. I trusted you. I trusted this company. I believed that hard work and results mattered more than office politics and personal relationships. I pulled out another document. This is a detailed analysis of departmental performance over the past 3 years. It shows that under my leadership, the engineering department exceeded revenue targets by an average of 23%. It shows that the projects I initiated generated over $12 million in revenue. The CEO tried to interrupt. Miss Graves, these figures are accurate, I finished. I've had them verified by an independent accounting firm. I've also had them reviewed by the SEC to ensure compliance with all disclosure requirements. I held up a third document. This is a proposal for restructuring the engineering department. It includes a plan for recovering the revenue lost due to recent personnel decisions, a timeline for project completion, and a detailed budget analysis. The room was completely silent now. Even the whispers had stopped. I'm not here for revenge, I said quietly. I'm here because I believe in this company. I believe in its mission, its potential, its people. But I don't believe in management that prioritizes personal comfort over shareholder value. The CEO called for a 30-minute reset. The room cleared slowly, people gathering in small groups, voices low and urgent. Margaret rushed out without looking at me. The CEO disappeared with his legal team. I stayed at the podium, organizing my papers, accepting congratulations from shareholders I'd never met. An elderly woman in pearls shook my hand and said, "It's about time someone stood up to them." A young man in a rumpled suit asked if I was planning to run for the board. I wasn't sure what I was planning. I'd prepared for this moment for weeks, but I hadn't thought much about what would come after. When the meeting reconvened, the CEO looked like he'd aged 5 years in 30 minutes. His opening statement was brief and carefully worded. After careful consideration, the board has decided to accept Miss Graves' proposal for review. We'll be establishing a special committee to investigate the concerns raised today. It wasn't enough. I stood up again. I appreciate the board's willingness to consider my proposal, I said, but I think we need to be more specific about timelines and accountability. I'm calling for a formal vote on Margaret Chen's removal, to be held within the next 2 weeks. The legal counsel stood up. Miss Graves, that's not how these things work. There are procedures, protocols. There are also shareholder rights, I interrupted. And I'm exercising them. I looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. I'm not asking you to take my word for anything. I'm asking you to look at the facts, look at the performance data, look at the financial impact of recent decisions. Then vote your conscience. The CEO cleared his throat. The board will consider your request and respond within 10 business days. 5 business days, I countered. This is a time-sensitive matter. Every day we delay is another day of lost revenue, another day of damaged morale, another day of broken trust. He nodded reluctantly. 5 business days. The vote was held on a Tuesday morning in the same ballroom where everything had started. This time, I didn't sit in the back row. I sat in the front, next to the other major shareholders, wearing the same black dress I'd worn to the original meeting. Margaret had submitted her resignation the day before. The CEO announced it at the beginning of the meeting. His voice carefully neutral. Margaret Chen has decided to pursue other opportunities. We thank her for her service and wish her well in her future endeavors. The formal vote was unanimous. The proposal to restructure the engineering department passed. The proposal to implement new transparency measures passed. The proposal to establish regular shareholder communication passed. But the biggest surprise came at the end. Finally, the CEO said, "I have an announcement about leadership changes. After extensive discussion with the board, we've decided to create a new position, Chief Innovation Officer. This person will oversee all engineering projects and report directly to me." He paused, looking directly at me. "Emily Graves, would you be willing to accept this position?" The room was silent. I stood slowly, my hands steady, my voice calm. "I appreciate the offer, but I have a counter-proposal." I walked to the podium one last time. "I'm announcing my candidacy for Chief Executive Officer." The silence that followed was different from the shocked silence of 2 weeks ago. This was the silence of recognition, of inevitability, of change finally arriving. I believe this company needs leadership that puts shareholders first, employees second, and personal politics last. I believe it needs someone who understands that trust is earned through actions, not promised through words. I looked out at the room full of faces, some supportive, some skeptical, some afraid. I'm not asking you to choose me because of what happened to me. I'm asking you to choose me because of what I can do for this company, for its shareholders, for its future. 6 months later, I was elected CEO by the largest margin in company history. I kept my grandfather's stock certificates framed on my office wall, not as trophies, but as reminders that sometimes the quiet ones are the ones to watch. And sometimes when people mistake your silence for weakness, they forget that quiet people are often the ones who hear everything, see everything, and remember everything. They forget that we're not weak, we're just getting ready.